At the end of the 1600s, the limits of European settlement were only 80 kilometers from Cape Town. However, during the 1700s, that line moved more than 800 kilometers further as hunters, traders, raiders, and cattle farmers pushed eastward into the interior. During the same period, as we have discussed last week, the limits of Amatkosa settlement were slowly moving westward. In about 1770, the vanguard of white settlement reached the outlying Xhosa chiefdoms, opening up the so-called eastern frontier. Here, European and black pastoralists dispossessed and subjugated the last of the Ku clans. It was here too that a process of interaction began between white and black, something which has dominated South African history. For 40 years, Trekboers and the Amatkosa, both sometimes aided by the Ku, struggled for supremacy, neither one actually succeeding, until in 1812 a combined colonist and Ku force under British military leadership finally pushed the Amatkosa over the Fish River and out of the Zuurveld. During the course of the 18th century, or the 1700s, Ku clans retreated in the face of the colonist expansion until they were east of the Gamtoos River. The Amatkosa, pushing westward, forced other Ku to withdraw in the direction of the Fish River. In the area between the Fish and the Gamtoos rivers, various Ku clans combined to form chiefdoms, each headed by a chief of limited authority. In the late 1700s, the most important chiefdoms in the area were those of the Gona, who had incorporated Amatkosa into their ranks on a large scale, as well as the Ungekwa. The Trekboers, Dutch colonists who usually called themselves Christians, reached the western outer reaches of the Zuurveld by the end of the 1760s. They had gradually settled into the interior by acquiring loan farms from the government at the time, which was the Dutch East India Company. In the densely populated areas, each family consisted of several related nuclear families living close together under the leadership of the senior male, or the patriarch. On these farms, there were often one or two Bywooners, or Europeans who had no claim to the land, as well as Khoi servants and their families, and in the case of wealthy landowners, a few slaves. Briefly looking at the Amatkosa, they were organized at three levels: the patrilineages, consisting of the descendants of a known common ancestor; patriclans, composed of a number of lineages all claiming descent from one common ancestor; and chiefdoms, which were political units, each occupying a certain area under a chief. The westernmost chiefdom, which was the Kunukwebe, were distinct from the others as they had mixed with the Gona Ku, who were not regarded as equals by Amatkosa groups in which they were incorporated. Historian Herman Gillemier maintains that it's conceivable that the Kunukwebe were regarded as inferior by the Amatkosa because of the partial Ku origin. The Kunukwebe chief was belittled by other chiefs because he was not of royal blood. However, there is no evidence that he was politically subordinate to them in the late 1700s. As we have discussed before, the Amatkosa were pastoralists. They lived on well-watered lands in dispersed village settlements, each of which could supply most of the economic needs of its inhabitants. A chief was forced to expand at the expense of his neighbors if a territory could no longer satisfy the needs of his people. A similar occurrence was happening in colonial society. Capital was scarce, and extensive use of the land was the norm. When an area became densely populated, the European farmers did not attempt to increase the carrying capacity of the land, but rather expanded further, thus forcing the Ku out. When expansion beyond the colony was no longer possible, taking land in between the existing loan farms or expansion into Amatkosa territory was seen as the only solutions. Therefore, during the late 1780s, early 1790s, the Zuurveld became a space where chiefdoms and European farmers competed for land. This competition was made worse by conflicting views about land ownership. The Europeans considered a certain defined area as belonging exclusively to them, whereas the Amakosa saw land as communal property, the boundaries of which were almost never defined. Conflict over livestock was also important, for in both Amakosa and colonial society, cattle was a major form of capital and a recognized symbol of wealth. Raids to supplement stocks or recoup losses were endemic in the frontier struggle. The eastern frontier not only had a geographical dimension, but also a social one. Unlike a border or a boundary, which demarcates spheres of political control, the frontier is an area where colonization is taking place. Here, two or more ethnic communities coexist with conflicting claims to the land, and no authority is recognized as legitimate by all the parties, or is able to exercise undisputed control over the area. Thus, the emphasis is on coercive power, the ability to forcibly impose goals in the face of opposition from others. Therefore, one of the major characteristics of the frontier zone is that it's a disputed area, claimed at one stage or other by various peoples living there. Sometime between 1750 and 1780, the Kunukwebe were settling in the Zuurveld between the Bushmans and Fish rivers. They were followed by the Mbalu, the Gwali, the Imidange, and the Amantinde. During the 1700s, the colonists started occupying the Zuurveld. Trapped between the Amakosa and colonists, the Ku chiefdoms started to disintegrate. The Zuurveld became an area where various attempts were made to legitimize conflicting claims to the land. The Hunqikwa claimed prior occupation, but the Kunukwebe insisted that their chief at the time, Chaka, had purchased land between the Fish and Kawi rivers from the Hunqikwa leader. This was denied by the Hunqikwa. The colony's claim was based on the boundary settlement concluded by Governor van Plettenberg in 1778, when he had persuaded some Gwali chiefs to recognize the upper reaches of the Fish River and Bushmans River mountains as the boundary of the colony. 2 years later, in 1780, this claim was expanded when the Council of Policy proclaimed the Fish River along its entire length as the boundary. Thus, the land between the Bushmans and Fish rivers, the same land which the Kunukwebe were using, was now also regarded as colonial territory. Some Amakosa and Ku obviously disputed this. However, no one waited for these disputes to be resolved. Europeans, Ku, and Amakosa settled down close to one another. Another characteristic of the frontier is the lack of a single government able to exercise undisputed authority over all individuals in the frontier zone. There were various authorities exercising some control over their respective communities, but while they were considered legitimate by probably the majority of their subjects, they were often too weak to prevent challenges which ranged from unauthorized action to rebellion. No Amakosa authority was able to fill the vacuum, as there was no real political leader who could make decisions and agreements without the consent of the various Amakosa chiefdoms that would be affected. The colonial officials failed to understand this. They attempted to find a supreme chief with whom an agreement could be made which could bind the Amakosa on both sides of the Fish River. Eventually, they attempted to establish peace between the Khachabe chief, whom they regarded as paramount, and the Zuurveld chiefs, who claimed that they were at war with him and therefore afraid to return over the fish. Secondly, the Zuurveld Amakosa leaders could only control their subjects or bind them in negotiations to a limited extent. The authority of chiefs was limited, as the rationale of serving a chief was the security which he provided in return for the accumulation of cattle. So, punishing subjects for enriching themselves in a raid was a risk none of those chiefs were willing to make. Lastly, the colonial government failed to establish itself as an undisputed authority on the frontier. The colonists originally accepted the Dutch East India Company's authority, but they were concerned with two aspects of company rule. First, they wanted to be incorporated into the landholding system of the colony. Here, the company would recognize their claim to the land in return for their acknowledgement of company rule and their agreement to pay rent for their farms. Secondly, colonists wanted the government to appoint a capable person to be field commandant from their own ranks. This would be the start of the commando system, which was fundamental for the colonists' security on the frontier. Under this system, the colonists were required to serve on these commandos against indigenous enemies, while the government provided ammunition for these expeditions. The company's authority was further undermined by the inadequacy of its military and police force. The establishment of the Graaff-Reinet district in 1786 only slightly increased its control over the frontier. The Landros there was assisted by only 4 or 5 mounted policemen. In a situation where colonists had almost free access to guns and ammunition and considered it their right to fire on raiders, the Landros could not remotely claim to monopolize the use of force. As a result, his authority and the colonists' respect for colonial laws suffered accordingly. Landros Vuke of Graaff-Reinet remarked in a letter to the colonial government that unless he was aided by 50 or 60 soldiers, the rot will continue to such an extent where anarchy might take hold of the district. In these circumstances, the Landros was forced to rely on the field cornets to ensure compliance with the laws in their respective divisions. But the field cornets were dependent on the support of their fellow colonists and often chose to uphold their interests. Thus, the key role in local administration came to be played by men who were often agents of the colonists rather than of the colonial government. Company officials on the frontier were unsuccessful in asserting their authority over the Amaxhosa and the Zuurveld. The chiefs soon sensed that these officials were unable to make good their threats to forcibly remove them. The officials also exploited the widening rift between the government in Cape Town and the frontier colonists. On the other hand, the colonists did succeed in establishing their authority over the Kru, whose political structure had disintegrated under European and Amaxhosa impact. In the fragmented political structure of the frontier, it was common for various ethnic communities, or rather groups within these communities, to form alliances to obtain specific ends. Thus, an alliance of Amachagabe leaders and colonists arose against the Zuurveld Amaxhosa. The Amachagabe leaders wished to integrate the various Amaxhosa chiefdoms in the west under their control, while the colonists wanted the complete removal of these chiefdoms. To counter this, the Kunukwebe incorporated Kru and slaves who had run away from European farms. The conflicts between the colonists and the colonial government also saw both sides attempting to enlist allies across ethnic lines. In the rebellions on the frontier, some colonists sought the help of the Amaxhosa. As late as 1803, Governor Janssens would tell Graaff-Reinet farmers that if disorder in the district did not cease, he would have to adopt such measure as would exterminate those who were the cause of turbulence, even if it were to be with the assistance of Amaxhosa and or Kru. During the period of 1770 to 1812, one can distinguish 2 phases overlapping one another in time and geographical space in the evolution of the frontier. These may be called the open and the closing frontier. According to Gillemere, there was a fluidity on the open frontier which contrasted strongly with the closing frontier. On the open frontier, a low population density allowed Kru laborers to move freely to and from farms. It was comparatively easy to desert, and employers were often unable to use coercion effectively. Thus, the laborers who had been attracted to their service could be called clients, as distinct from the unfree laborers of the closing frontier. Related to this was the complexity of a situation in which the 3 major contending parties, the Kru, the Amaxhosa, and colonists, were each unable to exert coercive power over all inhabitants in the region. Aims were pursued more commonly through negotiations than through violence. There was an uncertainty of status. Europeans were not all masters. Non-Europeans were not all servants. This produced the paradox of, on the one hand, a degree of cooperation between ethnic groups, and on the other, bitterness and rivalry, as members of different groups attempted to find a footing on which they could base their relationship. Although some Kru settlements had been devastated by amaXhosa and trekboer alike, many Kru were incorporated into these societies relatively peacefully. However, the Zuurveld was not a safe place. Lions presented a hazard to colonists, Kru and amaXhosa alike, and sand raiders were thieving cattle herds as an easy source of food. As a result, many Kru sought the protection of amaXhosa groups. However, often this came at the expense of their cattle in any event. Added to this, during the first phase of incorporation, Kru were usually simple menial servants. The Kru who rejected amaXhosa rule but still desired protection and the chance to build up their herds and flocks attached themselves to the trekboers. In such relationships, a Kru entering a trekboer's service retained his livestock. This livestock was supplemented by payments in kind which they received for tending the trekboer's cattle and accompanying them or taking their place on commandos against the sun. The opgaaf rolls, or census list for tax purposes, show that many Kru in colonial service owned a considerable number of cattle. For example, a census taken in 1798 lists between 1,300 and 1,400 Kru heads of households in the Graaff-Reinet district. They owned 140 horses, 7,571 cattle, and 30,557 sheep, an average of 5 cattle and 23 sheep per head of household. However, there were some who owned a whole lot more. Adrian, a Kru servant, owned 30 cattle and 207 sheep. Clara, in the service of a D.P. Liebenberg, owned 33 cattle and 177 sheep, while Adrian Deering owned 58 cattle and 250 sheep. Those Kru who owned more livestock than average tended to be concentrated on a few farms, which suggests that they were living in traditional communities on the farm. For the Kru, the transition from independent herders to clients may not have been traumatic, provided they retained their stock and maintained bonds with their clan or kinsmen, perhaps settling with them on a boer's farm. This could explain why some trekboers had so many Kru in their service while others had so few. Thus, the frontier was as much a place where disparate groups attempted to maintain existing conditions and institutions as one in which, as some historians have suggested, new modes of life and new institutions originated. In adopting a conservative strategy, the Kru often obtained better economic terms from the colonists than from the amaXhosa, who would often seize their stock. However, their social prospects in the sense of full incorporation with the new society were far better with the amaXhosa. The Kru did not develop into a separate class of people when mixing took place with the amaXhosa. Rather, their descendants became amaXhosa. In colonial society, however, they were rarely baptized, seldom married colonists, and was never granted burgher status. Despite the extent at which mixing was taking place, it did not take long before the Kru came to form an inferior class in colonial society. In other ways, the open frontier also spelled the decline of the Kru. As they lost land, they lost their political leverage in colonial society. They also inevitably became embroiled and often bore the brunt of hostilities between the amaXhosa and colonists. Indeed, the Kru were essential to the commandos as trackers and riflemen, and often it was the Kru herdsmen who were the first to be killed in amaXhosa raids. The colonists and the amaXhosa had an uneasy relationship ever since first contact in the 1770s. The high value with which each attached to cattle, and the opportunities each saw for supplementing stock through raiding and trading, became both sources of positive interaction and sources of conflict between the two peoples, who soon were to find that they couldn't live with nor without each other. Barter was the initial tie that brought colonists and Amaxhosa together. Many Amaxhosa were keen to acquire European copper, iron, and beads, which they used to obtain from Kru middlemen. European officials and colonists regarded such trade as an excellent opportunity to acquire cheap livestock. Some tried to barter with the Amaxhosa as they had with the Kru, by persuading them to part with their cattle. The difference was that the Amaxhosa had the means to retaliate strongly if they were cheated or dispossessed of their cattle. Eventually, the company government stepped in and declared it illegal for colonists to barter with the Amaxhosa. This was partly due to rising tensions between colonists and Xhosa, but also because the company had the desire to control the trade for itself, thereby making the colony less dependent on the colonists for its meat supply. Even after such a ban on trade was announced, however, illegal cattle trading continued between colonists and Amaxhosa. In 1786, Field Sergeant H.J. von Rensburg reported that many, if not all, of his fellow colonists were guilty of bartering with the Amaxhosa. Labor was a second tie as well as a source of conflict. The Kru were unevenly distributed among the farms, not only because the Kru families were unwilling to split up, but also because they could not always get better working conditions elsewhere. Thus, many farmers were forced to seek Amaxhosa labor. To those Amaxhosa who had suffered misfortune, this was an acceptable opportunity to build up their livestock and earn food. But there were various points of friction. For example, when herdsmen lost cattle through negligence, they were punished. Misunderstandings also arose over payment, with colonists withholding wages. There were constantly disputes between colonists and Amaxhosa laborers. The laborers would inform their chiefs of any maltreatment committed against them and would return to steal cattle from the colonists as a form of compensation. This was considered by Landros as a cause of the 1793 war. Another activity that was a source of conflict was begging, or at least what colonists regarded to be begging. To the Amaxhosa, this was reciprocal exchange in which a poor person asked for food from someone without offering payment. In traditional Amaxhosa society, this was given because the giver saw it as insurance against the day that he or himself might experience need. At first, the colonists gave food to build up goodwill. However, soon this practice became a source of friction. As the Amaxhosa population in the Zuurveld grew, increasing numbers of Amaxhosa visited farms to request or even demand food. In some cases, it was difficult to distinguish between begging and demanding a payment of tribute. The traveller Liechtenstein wrote, "In peace, the Xhosa expect as a sort of tribute what in war they seize by force. They often come in large bodies and will stay several days or even weeks. Their importunity, their numbers, and the fear of quarrelling with them commonly secure them good entertainment." Thus, those Amaxhosa who had earlier moved into the Zuurveld, mainly as a result of political developments in Xhosa land across the Fish, were now joined by others seeking pasture and opportunities for barter, labor, and begging. Some were fleeing from their home regions after committing a crime or having been defeated in war. These Amaxhosa moved in groups, bringing along large numbers of cattle. In this way, Jeremia contends two cultures both valuing land as a means of production and cattle as a source of wealth and prestige were brought together in a single area. The colonists carried with them a set of attitudes to the frontier, most important of which was the notion that as Christians, they were culturally superior to the heathen blacks whom they often associated with crudeness, conflict, and treachery. Although a few Trekboers went to live among the Amaxhosa, the colonists were bent on excluding them from their culture and kinship network, and from their political system. For the Amakosa, their encounters with the trekboers during the course of the 18th century were such that many distrusted and feared them. However, partly because they outnumbered the trekboers, they never feared that they would be dominated by them. The Amakosa were open in incorporating and integrating non-Nguni speakers. There is evidence that the Amakosa were inclined to incorporate the trekboers in the same way. However, they were unsuccessful, often being rebuffed by the trekboers, who misunderstood their approaches. So, during this period, the colonists and Amakosa kept their separate identities, each group to a large extent regarding the other as standing outside their moral community. Such an attitude could explain the wartime atrocities, such as the mutilation of corpses by the Amakosa and the abduction of Amakosa children, which only worsened relations. Yet, however important the ethnic differences were, many historians state that it's hard to believe that the conflict between colonists and Amakosa would have occurred on such a large scale, had it not been for their opposing material interests. It is difficult to say which the most important source of conflict was, land or cattle. The colonists clearly desired the Zuurveld all for themselves, mostly because the land could not provide pasture for the cattle of both themselves and the Zuurveld Amakosa. However, such was the stalemate in the battle to control the Zuurveld, that possession of cattle became an equal or even more important alternative. This is illustrated by the events of the First War of Dispossession of 1779 to 1781. Towards the end of the 1770s, the princes of Agterbrankieshoogte raided cattle east of the Fish and killed Amakosa in the process. Bands of Amakosa retaliated late in 1779, capturing large numbers of cattle, 21,000 according to usually exaggerated estimates of the colonists. This led to commandos in 1780 and 1781, in which the raiding of cattle was the main activity. It seemed then that the acquisition of cattle through force became the main tactic of these initial conflicts. Hubert Dirk Campagne, an observer sympathetic to the colonists, explained that while it was not possible to subjugate the Amakosa by force of arms, it was easy to capture cattle. In the case of the Zuurveld Amakosa, there was a parallel tendency to attach prime importance to control cattle rather than land. When the First War broke out, their main concern was cattle, protecting their own and capturing their enemies' herds. After a skirmish, they were quite prepared to withdraw across the Fish River, provided they could keep their booty. The one exception was the Kunukwebe, not of royal lineage, and acknowledging the Galeka rather than the Chagabe chief as paramount, the Kunukwebe chief Shaka considered the position in the Zuurveld as crucial. Therefore, of all the Amakosa chiefs, he was the least inclined to retreat. Beyond the Fish, positioned between him and his paramount, were the Chagabe and the Ndlambe, who might easily capture his cattle and conquer or even destroy his chiefdom. If Chaka were to maintain his autonomy, the Zuurveld was definitely the safest place. The fact that the Kunukwebe, to a far greater degree than the other Amakosa, had entered into the service of the trekboers and had close links with the coup in the colony, also explains their determination to stay. In conclusion, the period 1770 to 1792 had given rise to the preconditions of the strife and warfare which would engulf the Zuurveld in the 2 decades after 1793. In summary, these preconditions were conflicts over land and cattle, the absence of any force which could impose peace and order, maltreatment of coup and Amakosa servants, the transfer of allegiance of some coup clients of the colonists, the presence in colonial territory of large numbers of Amakosa who the colonists perceived as a threat to their lives and property, and mutual suspicion and mistrust, which, as the result of individual acts of violence and aggression, grew into bitterness and hate. For example, during the First War, Adrian van Jaarsveld tossed out some tobacco to a band of Amantinde. While they were picking up the tobacco, he and his men fired on them, killing many. He later explained that he had feared treachery. According to J.H. Soga, this incident gnawed at the minds of the Amantinde even into the 20th century. In an atmosphere so infused with fear and violence, the outbreak of prolonged armed hostilities became a distinct probability.